and welcome to Macros with Mythili, the ET Now show that takes a hard look at all the major macroeconomic issues and developments in India and overseas. Well, it's been a little over a week since the maiden budget of the first woman full-time finance minister, Nirmala Sitharaman, and we're still trying to understand the fine print of the budget. So in the second of our series of Macros with Mythili programs post the budget, I have with me three experts. Dr. C. Rangarajan, who over a long and distinguished career has worn a number of hats, including Governor, Reserve Bank of India, Chairman, Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council to the former Prime Minister Manmohan Singh, Vinayak Chatterjee, Chairman, Feedback Infra, whose name is synonymous now with infrastructure development in the country, and the straight-talking R. Jagannathan, Editorial Director, Swarajya Magazine, to help me do just that, dissect the budget. So over the next 30 minutes or so, we're going to look at the budget announcements and the documents with a fine-tooth comb to unearth both the positives and the negatives, and of course the googlies that invariably escape us in the immediate aftermath of the budget. So let me welcome to the show Dr. Rangarajan, Vinayak, and of course Jaggi. Thank you so much for joining us. Let me start by asking each of you in turn a question that will perhaps haunt us in the days to come, which is that even accepting the limitations of the union budget in that it is not a magic wand, given the present growth slowdown, should we commend or condemn, a slightly harsh word I agree, Nirmala Sitharaman for budgeting to better the interim budget target of the fiscal deficit? Have we carried this fixation with a somewhat arbitrarily determined fiscal deficit target a bit too far? What is the sanctity of that 3% target? Sure, it is part of the Maastricht Treaty, but many European Union countries, including France and Germany, gave short shrift to it when it suited them. Let me start with you, Dr. Rangarajan.
Well, I have always held the view that we need a rule, and the 3% rule is a good rule because there is a lot of logic behind it. It's a question of how much are the savings, both domestic and external, available, and how it is to be distributed among the various sectors. Therefore, there is a big difference between Europe and India. The Maastricht Treaty requires the countries to adopt or to conform to a 3% rule for all levels of government, center, state, local, and all that. Whereas in India, the 3% rule applies only to the center. With the states taken together, it is 6% of the GDP. I cannot go into it this morning because it's a detailed thing, but there is quite a bit of logic behind this rule of 3% of the GDP being a good level of fiscal deficit. Now, I am not clearly saying that you should always stick to 3% or 3.3 or 3.4. I don't make much difference between 3.4% and 3.3%. But what the budget really conveys is commitment to the fiscal deficit route of consolidation.
Vinayak, you know better than most how desperately short we are of infrastructure. And though lack of funds is only one of the many reasons holding back infrastructure development, it is an important reason. So should the government have been a little less rule-bound and more sensible, pragmatic, and use the additional fiscal deficit leeway to fund infrastructure?
I'd just like to pay my respects to Dr. Rangarajan because I was a student of his and he taught us economics at IIM Ahmedabad, and those were classroom sessions we have never forgotten in our lives. To get back to your question, Mythili, I think let's step back and take a look at the broad picture on infra. If you see the budget, if you see the BJP manifesto, and if you see the economic survey, and if you see the budget speech, all of them concur that the country requires 100 lakh crores of infrastructure investments in the next 5 years, that is till 2024. Now, I have done some very quick back of the envelope calculations, and this is not an unreasonable number. The 100 lakh crore target is at the rate of 20 lakh crores per annum is a very logical target. Now come to the budget. If this country has to meet this logical target of 20 lakh crores of infra investment every year, the question is the funding. Now, if you really look at the budget allocations, if you look at both the center and the states, if you look at certain extra budgetary resources that the government can raise through its surrounding institutions and corporations, which I broadly call the statal system, the capacity to invest of the statal system is not more than 10 lakh crores, which is 50% of the desired run rate. So where is the balance 10 lakh crores going to come from? Obviously, this is an issue that has seriously bothered the government and the finance minister, and you will see the budget speech is peppered with references once again to revival of PPP, to BOT, which was not very fashionable in the last 5 years, unfortunately, to tapping pools of global capital, to setting up an expert committee to look at long-term fundraising in infrastructure, including the possibility of setting up a dedicated financial institution, a DFI, once again an old-fashioned DFI for infra.
Okay, Jaggi, Dr. Rangarajan feels it is right to stick to fiscal numbers, a very fairly rigid target. Vinayak takes a slightly different view. He says we need to promote private sector investment, but given that we've been trying so hard to promote private sector investment and it hasn't happened over the last first 5 years, so was there a case for being a little less uptight about sticking to, as I said, a rather arbitrarily determined fiscal deficit number? Jaggi?
Yeah, broadly I would say that what Dr. Rangarajan says about sticking to broad rules, I think that is unexceptionable. What you need to do is you need to be flexible with the rules. You must look at averages rather than a specific number like 3% or 3%. For a country like India, a growth rate of 5% or 5.5% is a disaster. It's as good as a recession in the US. So if we do not grow at about 6 or 7%, forget about 8 or 10, you're going to be in deep trouble. And without the necessary fiscal adjustments, which means a certain amount of relaxation this year and probably even next, you're not going to achieve that. While you may pay a small cost in terms of slightly higher inflation, but when you've been averaging inflation rates of 2.5% and 3.5% for the last 5 years, and you have actually had a deflationary kind of government where the insistence is on tax compliance, growing after bag money, reducing the double balance sheet problem, and increasing, let's say, the kind of money things like GST and all these are actually deflationary short-term moves. In this kind of a thing, if the fisc is put into a corset, you're going to get into deep trouble. I think you need to relax it and try and achieve an average of 3 to 3.5 range over a 3 or 5 year period, and not a specific goal for every single year. It doesn't make sense, because when you are in trouble, you need to actually get the government to step in. That's the basic Keynesian idea.
Sure. So the jury is a bit divided on that, and unfortunately we'll never know. Only history will tell us whether Nirmala Sitharaman was wise or unwise. But Dr. Rangarajan, a key announcement in the budget speech also, and in fact a noted departure from the past, is government's decision to tap the overseas market with a sovereign bond issue. Proponents argue that it will give us access to cheap funds, help reduce government's preemption of private savings, and supplement the funds available for development spending. What is indisputable, however, is that successive governments and RBI governors in the past have had deep reservations on the subject. So, for the benefit of our viewers, can you briefly explain why we need to be very, very wary about tapping overseas markets in dollar-denominated notes?
The point is that in the 90s, and even later on, 1990s and later on, the question of sovereign borrowing has been raised. We felt at that time there was a general principle, namely for purely domestic use, we should not raise money from outside. So there was a general principle applied. Otherwise, the rule can go to everybody, and we can say anybody can go and borrow from outside. There should be no limit or restriction at all. What the government says about a lower rate applies to everybody. I personally think that the compromise was essentially made to allow the foreign investors to invest in rupee, in Indian government bonds in rupee terms. Now, why should we put a limit on it? Why don't we not raise that limit now if you want? That, I think, satisfies the needs of the government. That reduces the demand on the credit market within the debt market within the country. But at the same time, an additional source of funding to the government becomes available. Therefore, the point really is that sovereign borrowing requires sovereign rating. I do not know what rating Government of India will get. Perhaps the government have already discussed with people, but that is also a critical issue. Therefore, the purpose of raising foreign money for purely domestic purposes is something that is not, that doesn't appear to be appropriate.
Well, I very much share your views on your apprehensions, Dr. Rangarajan. But Vinayak, since the proceeds of these sovereign bonds are hopefully going to be used for infrastructure development, do you look at them with slightly less, if I may say, apprehension? But the question also, as Dr. Rangarajan said, how are we going to repay these bonds? Because they have to be repaid in foreign currency, and you're going to use them in India, and you're going to generate rupee returns. But how do you view them, Vinayak?
Mythili, just let's look at the target for global bonds raising in perspective. What I've just seen, the announcement from the finance ministry, is that they are looking at $10 billion. Now, $10 billion, 1 billion is roughly 7,000 crores. So you're looking at 70,000 crores worth of tranche to begin the exercise. I just earlier spoke about a 10 lakh crore deficit every year. From a 20 lakh crore need every year, the statal system can provide 10. That's what I said earlier. So when you see the perspective of a 10 lakh crores versus 70,000 crores raised from sovereign bonds, you realize that it can be additive, but it cannot be the solution to the problem. But there is a context in the sense that the global markets are awash with capital. There is a hunger among the foreign institutional investors to invest in Indian brownfield assets, as was seen in the first TOT bid of the Ministry of Highways. The reserve price was 6,500 crores and Macquarie won the bid by bidding 9,500 crores. Similar, so therefore, there is a hunger for worldwide funds to invest in operating brownfield assets. So if the government strategy is, as rightfully enunciated in the budget, to take a hard look at monetizing government-owned utilities, brownfield assets, then the look at raising foreign, allowing foreign capital or raising debt overseas is a good move. I wouldn't, at a level of $10 billion, I wouldn't get too worried about big issues of country risk and forex risk and all of that. I'd say let's get ahead with the $10 billion and let us see what lessons it has for us.
Jaggi, I want your quick views on sovereign borrowing. And another question that I need to actually add to this, because we have so many issues to discuss, is that customs duties have been hiked across the board on a number of items, driven by what the finance minister gave a list of objectives, but all of which sound rather protectionist to my mind. So are we going back to the days of import substitution, Jaggi?
See, on coming to the first question of the sovereign bond, I think testing the waters is not a bad idea. Obviously, we do not need to go whole hog and keep on increasing the sovereign bonds. It's good to check what your rating is, despite what your country rating is, whether you can get a rate that is even better than your country rating. It might be good to establish it, and $10 billion is a good way to test the waters. You talked about protectionism. I think it's a very bad way to go. While of course the globe is into a protectionist mode because of Trump and what all he's trying to do to leverage the economy size to get other countries to play ball. But I think we can keep going down that path, and ultimately we are all going to end up in ruin, all of us. We are all going to be losers. So it's not a good idea. It should be very limited to people who are thinking. For example, if you are trying to limit the damage only with the Chinese or something where you have some massive deficits, you can ask them to buy some more. That's possible. But trying to do a generalized kind of increase in customs and import duty rates goes against the basics of the economic strategy we adopted in 1991, which is to move towards a more liberalized and more open trade environment. So I think we are doing a lot of long-term damage in the pursuit of short-term protectionism. We should not be in that direction.
Yes, there unfortunately we seem to be following the bad example set by the US. But I'm afraid it's time for us to slip into a very short break. Please do stay with us. We'll get down to the sectoral announcements. Welcome back. You're watching Macros with Mythili, and I'm in discussion with three experts in trying to dissect and read the fine print of the budget documents and the budget speech. Dr. Rangarajan, there are a number of announcements on the banking front, including the promise of 70,000 crores for recapitalization of public sector banks. Will this make banks start lending again? Should it be given all in one go or in driblets? And is all of this quite meaningless unless there is governance reform, on which the budget is relatively silent? Because unless that happens, we're going to see a repeat of the build-up of NPAs. Dr. Rangarajan?
Well, I think the figure mentioned 70,000 crore appears to be fairly large, but I have not done the calculation, but probably the requirement may be even larger. Quite clearly, this amount must be made available at one go, because the cycle of credit flow will have to start, and that will get started only if this money reaches the banks. Therefore, in some sense, they probably will follow the same route that we have followed so far in terms of recapitalization, namely that there is nearly no cash outflow because they are invested by the banks in bonds, and therefore the net burden on the government is simply the interest on the bonds issued, that is the 70,000 crore worth of bonds. Therefore, in order for the banking system to start lending in a significant way, this amount should be made available to the banks as quickly as possible, and as I said, at one go. Now, whether this will still result in a substantial credit expansion, one doesn't know, but the process can start. The banks also have to find out a quick way to resolve the issue of non-performing assets. A haircut is needed, and when a haircut is proposed, it always creates problems. The investigating agencies all come in. Therefore, to keep the banks away from these investigating agencies, a mechanism should be found out.
Vinayak, overall, are you disappointed with what the budget has done for infrastructure? The FM promised 100 lakh crores investment for the infrastructure over the course of the next 5 years. But the budget speech is completely silent on where the money is going to come from, apart from saying that you're going to set up an expert committee. There's also talk of reviving the DFI model. So are we reinventing the wheel ultimately? And is the government also seeing infrastructure problems as purely a funding problem, when the problems really in infrastructure go beyond funding? Vinayak?
Well, let us just recognize that the budget can only go to a certain length. And I think the best part about this budget speech is that it clearly recognizes that. I would have been sadder if the FM had kept silent about raising resources beyond the budget. The fact that she has squarely addressed the issue by saying, look guys, we got a huge target. We got 20 lakh crores to do in a year. And I can only do so much from within the budget. So as a nation, let us now look at various ways of what we can do to raise resources. And she's outlined a menu of choices. The important thing now is to get cracking and implement those choices. And what I am really a little disheartened about is in the last 5 years, we really haven't made any great efforts to revive PPP. This is the government which in July 2014, in the first budget speech of Mr. Jaitley, announced a 500 crore allocation to set up a world-class institution called 3P India to actually revive and revitalize PPP. This is the government that appointed Dr. Kelkar to head the committee to revive PPP. And Dr. Kelkar and the committee produced a wonderful report. If you even read the report today, it has got a list of implementable ideas to immediately revive PPP. So she's pressed the right buttons in terms of recognition, and my desire now would be take all the concrete steps necessary, not in theory, but in practice, to revive PPP and implement the Kelkar committee report in letter and in spirit, and get the animal spirits which are being talked about, get those animal spirits back in private sector investments in infrastructure, both from domestic investors as well as global investors. That would be my outlook right now.
Jaggi, both the survey and the budget spoke of investment becoming the driver of growth, and in fact this was emphasized in the finance minister in her speech. But we saw no sign of that whatsoever in the budget allocations, and nor did we see any convincing policy announcements to induce the private sectors to start investing once again. Jaggi?
Yeah, I mean, except for one thing, which was recapitalizing banks, which will help the lending cycle to resume faster, I didn't see too many things. There was one more, I think they talked a lot about FDI, where they were talking about giving tax breaks for setting up semiconductor fabrication units and solar power systems and other things. But I think what they really need to do is, I think domestic capital and investment revival will take a while because of the slow change in the double balance sheet problem. But FDI from abroad can easily be leveraged if you are able to do one simple thing. One, the biggest problem is not that availability of capital, but your exchange rate risk. If the government can offer a reasonably costed say for example risk cover to foreign players in the next 3, 4, 5 years, say at 3% annual cost we will cover so much risk and all that. If they can leverage that, I think getting into TOT projects worth 5-10 lakh crores will be no problem, because the amount of foreign capital available is simply humongous. The world will be happy to take low returns of 5 or 6% a year provided you cover the exchange rate risk. If the government can leverage this one aspect, I think there will be no shortage of investment for projects and assets that are already on the ground, and there is no further need. You just start straight away on the TOT model. So I think these are the short-term things that you need to do. The long-term thing, the private capital investment revival will take a long time, because a lot of companies are being lost in the IBC process and various things. So the private capital is not going to be gung-ho about investing even after they have sold some of their best companies to new owners. So I think it is the FDI that needs to step in the short run, and the government can ensure this by making sure that their currency risk is mitigated to a substantial extent till the pump is primed. Say 2-3 years you give them that support. After that they will be more comfortable about taking on the risk themselves.
Okay, Jaggi, except for the fact that when you have dollar inflows, it makes our rupee much more uncompetitive at a time when our exports are already doing pretty poorly. Dr. Rangarajan, if I go back to the banking and financial sector space, has the FM somehow got carried away by the clamour from NBFCs for support? Because she's announced a number of measures. So is there not a moral hazard in coming to the rescue of what are essentially market participants? Also, does the RBI really have the bandwidth to ensure better regulation and supervision of so many NBFCs at a time when even their supervision of banks does leave something to be wanting?
Well, the supervision of NBFCs naturally falls under the jurisdiction of the Reserve Bank, because some of them are deposit taking, they are big lenders, and therefore their regulation and their control has to be under the purview of the Reserve Bank. In fact, they are now putting the housing national housing societies also under the purview of the Reserve Bank of India. When originally it was decided to give to National Housing Bank, it was essentially sharing some responsibility with some other institution. Perhaps what we should have done is to ensure that the National Housing Bank regulation is also up to the mark, rather than shifting it back to the Reserve Bank, increasing its own burden. But that is something that RBI and the NHB could have discussed among themselves. But coming back, yes, I think the regulation of NBFCs is very difficult, given the fact that there are so many of them running into thousands. But that responsibility has to be fulfilled by somebody, and therefore the Reserve Bank is doing it. The whole question now really is not so much the large number of small NBFCs. The problem is centered around some of the larger NBFCs. That at least should have been the special attention, should have come under the special attention of the Reserve Bank of India. I have read some of the proposals made in the budget to help the banks provide more credit, because ultimately the NBFCs have been borrowing from the banks, and if the banks have been very careful, the problem that we now face with the NBFCs would not have happened. It is really the fault lies with the banks. Therefore, the proposal that has been made regarding bearing some part of the risk that banks bear while lending to NBFCs I'm not sure how strong it will be. But nevertheless, the question is that there are two things that the Reserve Bank will have to do. A, the Reserve Bank must also look at what the banks are doing in relation to NBFCs. Second, look at the operation of the NBFCs directly.
Sure, absolutely, Dr. Rangarajan. I do agree with you, the fault lies with the banks. But as far as NBFCs are concerned, I strongly believe that the market is the best disciplinarian. If they fail, and the market will discipline them. But Jackie, if I can move away from the NBFCs and banking space to the taxation area, we've seen the backlash from foreign portfolio investors to the higher tax that is to be levied on non-corporate FPIs. Should we be cowed down by them or stand firm as the FM seems to be doing so far? After all, FPIs have the option of moving out of the relatively opaque trust structure and corporatizing themselves.
No, I think I am not a general fan of soak the rich policies. So trying to create new brackets in 2 to 5 crores and 5 crore plus and then tax them is fundamentally wrong. You haven't even created a direct taxes code and you go on ad hoc changes in tax rates and things. It's not a good idea. So the FPIs, I think, were unexpected victims in this particular move, but I think they can corporatize themselves. I do think that option is open to them, but it might take some while. In the short term, they may get mugged by the finance minister. But I think long term, it's not a good idea for the government to follow these kind of high tax policies. They ultimately end up in more evasion and not more compliance.
Vinayak, the FM has promised revival of the PPP, SPV route and also monetization of assets. Which of these are you most enthused about?
Both. They are not either or. Monetization of assets is a no-brainer. I don't think we have a choice. And revival of PPP will make up that 10 lakh crores per annum shortfall in the infrastructure spend budget. Both have to be done and they have to be done now. Just like the name of your channel.
Yes, you're right on that, Vinayak. We really have no time to lose at all, but I'm afraid we've run out of time completely. So we'll have to end this discussion now. And though we've managed to discuss only some of the key points, as with every budget, it will be days before we finally manage to go through all the fine print, because the devil, as they say, is always in the detail. So we will be returning to you over the next few weeks. So do keep watching as we come back to you again and again with finer and finer dissection of what the budget entails for all of us. Till then, it's goodbye from all of us at ET Now.